The ethical starting point for me is that as a general rule, of course this is where the debate will be, is when might this rule be violated, but as a general rule, it should be considered morally impermissible to remove healthy tissue from another person's body without asking their permission. Now, there are exceptions to that are made within the medical domain. So if I have, and typically it's not healthy tissue, of course, if I have part of my body that's rotting off because I have gangrene or something like this, and I'm a child and I can't legally consent, it's long been the case that parents are entitled, both morally and legally, to make a decision on behalf of their incompetent child to save the health or the life of the child. It's also been the case with male circumcision in particular, that there's been this further loophole that's been added for sort of religious and cultural considerations. Now, in my post, I mentioned what's commonly referred to as female genital mutilation, and I was trying to make a point about culturally motivated violence, not saying that the two forms of surgery are identical or strictly analogous. They aren't. There are important differences between them, both in terms of the surgery itself and very often the motivation behind it. But it's been the case that religiously motivated cutting of females' genitals of whatever form has been sort of culturally and in many cases legally, human rights campaigns have all pushed to sort of stop that altogether. But there still is this loophole for religiously motivated cutting of male genitals, and it's sort of the ethics of that the Cologne Court brought to bear. It didn't so much touch on the medical exceptions that there's rough agreement on that. So I think the religious issue is the important one. Is it permissible for the beliefs of the parents to motivate the removal of tissue from their child when the child has no opportunity to consent, when the child in a pluralistic society who's exposed to different ideas may in fact grow up and say, well, I don't actually hold to these beliefs, or I don't want to consider myself a part of this religious tradition. If they've been irreversibly marked with a sign of commitment or a covenant without having had any say-so, that rubs my ethical intuitions the wrong way, and that's maybe my opening gambit, and we'll see what you have to say.
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack. I'll start maybe with the easy part, and that is to go back to female genital cutting or female genital mutilation or whatever we want to call it. And I took exception to the quote that you employed in your blog post, and maybe we'll throw links up whenever we put this up somewhere so that people can access both of our posts, and then they can link off of yours. I think you link to Andrew, and I do as well, and so people can actually go see what it is we're talking about. But I think that the comparison is generally with infibulation, which is obviously the most extreme form of FGM, and of course I suggested that's a problematic comparison in terms of what's actually being done. But there's also this problematic comparison of sort of religiously motivated circumcision versus cultural circumcision, because, of course, one of the things that people who take on FGM attempt to do is to demonstrate that there isn't a religious sort of background for it. There are a lot of people who believe that it is mandated by religion, but that in fact that doesn't pan out, right? The infibulation, of course, is also sometimes known as pharaonic circumcision, and so it's in fact been around for quite some time and isn't related to Islam, right? And so there's this suggestion that this might be a practice that has gone on for a long time in predominantly Muslim societies, but that there isn't anything in the Quran, let's say, that mandates that it should go on. Quite the opposite, of course, is the case with male circumcision, both in Judaism and in Islam, where it's quite specific in terms of the mandate. And so in that sense, I think that there's a problematic comparison there. So that, in other words, one could say about FGM, look, this is a mistake, right? It's a mistake to claim that this is an important part of your religious tradition. It's simply not, right? And so we might say, well, if it's simply a practice that's gone on for a long time, that doesn't meet the standard that we want. But if it is in some sense religiously mandated, well, then we need to think more seriously about the issue. And so that takes us perhaps to the next point. But I'll throw that out there and see what you think.
Sure. Yeah, let's jump in here because there's more we could say about the quote I put up, and we could take the comparison about the procedure off in a different direction. But let's talk about religious motivation a bit more. So just to clarify what your position is if it could be convincingly argued by someone who seemed to be expert in Islam that there was in fact a religious mandate, that in fact Allah had required that female genitals had been cut into in a certain way, then that seems to you that would be a legitimate reason then for the practice to be carried out on a wide scale in societies that are governed by Islamic belief structures. Is that the case?
Well, not necessarily. What I would suggest is that it changes the sort of the discussion that we're going to have. In other words, if it is simply a practice that people say, well, we've done it a long time, I think you can quite easily say, well, that's, having done something terrible for a long time isn't enough of a reason to continue doing something terrible.
Sure, we've covered that ground with slavery, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I think that when we have a compelling religious argument, then we have to think about it differently. Now, at the very least, that's my understanding growing up in the United States, right? That there's a different bar when it comes to dampening down religious practices.
Sure. So we're talking about the interface here between the religious practices of a group that exists within a secular society, and we're trying to determine under what conditions does the state have the ability or the prerogative, or at least the historical practice of intervening and basically overruling the religious motivation, saying that's fine that's what you believe, but if you carry out this practice, there will be sort of legal consequences. So another example is if I belong to a religion that says I can punch you in the face, I might sincerely believe that, and I might go ahead and do that, but we would both agree that the state would be able to say, your beliefs are fine, but in this society, we'll have legal consequences for your inflicting this sort of harm on other people.
Sure, a religion that says I can't send my children to school, I can't educate them, right? We've contested that, here. So
a religion that withhold necessary medical care. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, this comes up as well. Okay, so far what I can tell about the difference you're making between female genital cutting and male genital cutting is that in the case of male genital cutting, on your view, there's a compelling religious case. In other words, you can say that according to Judaism, or perhaps Islam as well, if we're talking about the male form of circumcision that's practiced within Islam as well, that I'm not sure who the authority is here, because obviously there's disagreement within Judaism as well as within Islam about the obligatory nature of this practice. There are obviously many thoughtful and philosophically enlightened Jewish thinkers who have made compelling arguments against the practice of circumcision. So if what you're saying is maybe a majority of Jews or certain Jewish authorities have claimed that the best interpretation of their scripture shows that it's required by God, I want to push back against that claim. The other thing we could do is just sort of talk about, is this a compelling argument? We could sort of get into the religious justification if we want to. One way to do that is the way that I've approached in my blog post, is to say that there are certain groups who take literally each of God's mandates. These are fundamentalist groups that really do try to follow to the letter each of the things that it sort of is listed in various texts that they must do. And as I said, I think they score points for intellectual consistency. They're being quite consistent. When God says you must stone your daughters if they do this, then they go ahead and they stone their daughters. When God says you must treat your slaves in such and such a way, they hold slaves and they treat them in that way. Most religious practitioners and most Jews in contemporary modern societies I'm acquainted with and have read about are more moderate than this. And they agree that there are certain things that are, as you say, quite specific. I think you put before, there's a quite specific mandate in Genesis that Abraham and all his descendants must be circumcised on the 8th day and so on. It's true that it's specific, but it's, in the same breath, in the same sentence, in the same passage, there are also quite specific indications that God has given about how slaves must be treated and so on, and other customs that many Jews no longer follow. So if the argument is God says we have to do it and it's quite clear, I don't think that's a sufficient religious justification for the practice, simply because it's already the case that religiously intelligent practitioners have to do some interpretation. They have to bring their own ethical thought to bear. And I mean, this is a debate that goes back to Plato. You know, do the gods love an action because it's good, or is it good because the gods love it? I think it's more the case that there's ethical reasoning that we have to bring to bear as thoughtful people, and then we go back to our sacred texts and we say, well, if we took God literally here, we would have to say quite plainly that God is advocating something that we would consider to be morally impermissible, whether it's genocide or stoning of daughters or whatever it is. And once we've opened up that project, once we've taken that first step of not being literal in our interpretation, then the onus is on us to carry our ethical thought all the way through. And my argument has been that once we're engaged in that process thoughtfully, it becomes pretty clear that circumcision is incompatible with many of our other ethical sort of advances that we've made in the past 200 years. It's inconsistent with our biomedical ethics. It's inconsistent with our ideas about autonomy, individual rights, rights to integrity, and so on. If we want to be consistent, we can't use God says we have to do it anymore as a moral justification for practice, which is so out of sync with our other ethical intuitions and arguments.